Hey guys, how's it going? So recently I've been thinking about consciousness. I do that a lot. Consciousness is quite interesting to me. The thing about consciousness is that no one seems to know what it is. And it's not like most things in science where we kind of know vaguely a range of things it could be. People can't even agree on what the most fundamental aspect of consciousness even is. Most people can't even agree whether consciousness is real or not. Like, some people just think it's an illusion. They can't seem to decide whether material reality creates consciousness or whether consciousness creates material reality. Of course, I've got my own weird thoughts on all of this, but today I thought it might be a cool idea to explore the weird bugs in consciousness, the glitches, the inconsistencies, the things that don't really seem to make sense no matter how you think about them. I do have one weird one that I've never heard someone else bring up before that I'd like to share with you at the end as well, so let's go ahead and dive in. The first thing I'll bring up is the Mary's room thought experiment. So imagine Mary, who's a scientist, who knows everything there is to know about colour. No idea why she has to be called Mary in this thought experiment, but whatever. She's lived her whole life in a room that's black and white, like everything's painted black and white. I guess she's painted black and white, right? Somehow she's only ever experienced black and white before. But academically, she's an expert in colour. So she knows everything there is to know about colour that you can study, but she's never actually experienced it. And the thought experiment is, when she finally walks outside of the room and sees colour for the first time, does she learn something new? And if so, what is it? Kind of hard to put into words, right? If she already knew everything there was to know about it. Like, even if she did learn something new, she probably couldn't articulate what that thing is, because anything that she tries to describe is something that she would have already read and therefore could have already said. And yet there is something completely non-replicable about actually experiencing something, right? I know lots of facts about the planet Mars, but I imagine standing on it would be a whole different kind of an experience to just knowing things about it. First-hand experience isn't necessarily more useful. To be useful, it might be better to just have an analytical knowledge of something, but actually experiencing something firsthand is just a whole different caliber of conscious awareness of a thing. So here's my take on it. I think that you can think of consciousness like a bunch of different fields, each of which are producing some kind of qualia inside of them, and what separates one field from another is just the type of qualia that they can produce. For example, the visual field of awareness for each eye is this kind of oval-shaped, two-dimensional region on which different colours and brightnesses can appear, whereas the auditory field obviously has sounds in it, and they vary by things like amplitude and frequency. And since they exclusively can hold different types of qualia that are kind of irreconcilably completely different from one another, that means that your visual field can't have a sound inside of it, and your auditory field can't have color inside of it. Although, interestingly enough, taste and smell are kind of two separate senses, but also are close enough that you can smell something that's similar to how it tastes. Like, you can smell vanilla, but you can also taste vanilla, whereas you can't see yellow and hear yellow, right? That doesn't make sense in that context, but for some reason, taste and smell, that does make sense, which is interesting. To me, that implies there's kind of a latent space of possible sensory perceptions, and different types of qualia can be closer to or further away from each other within that space, which is kind of weird to think about. But the weirdest one is thought. I think of thought itself as a field within consciousness, and I'm never quite sure how to think about thought. That was a weird sentence, because on one hand, you could say that it's one field, like it's similar to all the other fields in that it's displaying the perceptions that you get from some kind of sensory organ. It's just that the sense is what your neurons are doing inside your own brain, which ultimately links to my take on free will as well, right? If thought is ultimately a perception. Regardless, you could also say that the thought field isn't just one field. You can separate different kinds of thought from each other, right? You can visualize something, but you can also imagine the smell of something. You've kind of got all the different fields within thought. It's almost like a shadow of all the other fields that you can sort of play with, independent of whatever the physical world outside of your neurons is doing. And there are also thought fields which don't map onto any other type of perception that we have, like what we would usually describe as cognition, you know, where you're like adding sums together and doing logic and equations and shit like that. And just to flesh out this model of consciousness a little bit more, when I think about other animals as consciousness, I think of them as conscious just like we are, but they potentially have different fields within their awareness, and also any of the fields that they do have, whether they have similar or different types of qualia in them from what we can perceive, there's also potentially a difference in resolution. So for example, I think some types of birds have famously good eyes, unless that's a myth that I'm stupid for believing. So their visual field within consciousness, you can almost think of as being bigger than ours is, or deeper, or higher resolution, or, you know, however you want to think about it. Humans tend to think of ourselves as being more conscious than other animals, but the way I'd say it is, we do have much larger cognitive fields than other animals do. That doesn't mean that animals are less capable of feeling pain or pleasure than humans are. They just don't have a cognitive field that's quite as viscerally high resolution as ours is. But I really do think consciousness is just the sum of all the fields. When I say that, people bring up the criticism of saying, well, does that mean that I think that blind people or deaf people are less less conscious? And the thing is, I suppose it does, although just to be clear, I absolutely would not word it that way. What I mean by conscious in this context is not what most people mean by consciousness, because most people have attached the idea of consciousness to, specifically, the cognitive field. They almost seem to reduce what consciousness is to just that, right? Like just the intelligence aspect. And if that's your view, then someone saying that a blind person has one less aspect of consciousness sounds like an offensive, dehumanizing thing to say about blind people, but really it's only offensive if you think that they're talking about something like cognition, which is not what I'm saying, because different fields are not correlated to each other. You can lose one and retain all the others. So really, I think this is more a miscommunication than anything else. I hope I'm navigating this fairly well so I don't sound like a giant asshole. The idea that blind people are philosophical zombies is exactly the opposite of what I'm saying, just to be clear. Anyway, in the context of the Mary's room thought experiment, which is what I'm actually meant to be talking about, whenever Mary is inside the room studying colour but only actually seeing in black and white, she's essentially filling her fields of thought with certain contents, and those contents don't correspond to anything in any of her other fields of awareness, whereas when she walks outside the room, she essentially starts to be able to experience a whole new axis of qualia within her visual field, and now she gets to correspond that to the contents that she already has in her thought field. And since a large part of the thought field is essentially just building models about how reality works, that allows her to build a more detailed conceptual model in her thought field that corresponds to certain qualia that she's experienced within a certain field of awareness. That in and of itself is a type of thing that we would refer to as knowledge, so I would say yes, she does learn something new. Christ, it took me a while to get to the answer on this one. Let's see if I can speed these up. The ship of Theseus. Excuse me. The ship of Theseus. Okay, so this is the idea that it kind of feels like you're one person, and that one person is continuous throughout your life, right? You can think back to when you were a 10-year-old, unless you're a 9-year-old. I hope there are no 9-year-olds watching this. Go back to playing Fortnite and giving your friends body dysmorphia or whatever the fuck it is that 9-year-olds are doing nowadays. When you think back to who you used to be, it feels like you were the same person then as you are now. Like there's just a continuous, unbroken chain of consciousness. Apart from when you went to sleep or got knocked out when you got hit by a car that one time. But you know what I mean? It feels like the conscious thing that you are now is just the conscious thing that you were then, but time has elapsed, right? That's how it feels. But the Ship of Theseus thought experiment asks, well, what if you replaced all of the bits of you with different bits, right? If you took every molecule out of your body and replaced it with a different molecule, but you did it identically. So if you replace a sodium atom, you replace it with another sodium atom. If you take a neuron out of your brain, you replace it with another identical neuron. But you are replacing them. You are completely different atoms after this thing has happened. So the question is, are you the same person after this process has happened? Are you the same conscious being that you were at the beginning afterwards? Intuitively, you'd think no, but the human body does have a way of swapping out all of its atoms over time. Different organs do it at different rates, but if you're like a 50-year-old guy right now, pretty much none of you that was you when you were 10 is now a part of you. You're like completely different atoms now, or, you know, more or less. I'm sure someone's going to be like, don't you know that the prostate only swaps out all of its molecules once every 400,000 years? Okay, but close enough, you know what I'm saying? So clearly it doesn't matter, but if you do it all at once, it kind of seems like it would matter. This kind of relates to the teleportation paradox. Imagine if you step into a machine and it teleports you from one place to another, but the way that it does this is it basically destroys your body and then either sends the atoms or molecules over to another location and rebuilds you in exactly the same way that you were before you died, right? Maybe it scans you 1 second before it kills you and then it reconstructs you exactly the same on the other side. Or potentially, maybe they just send the information that allows another machine to reconstruct you from atoms and molecules that it already has there. So the question is, are you the same person after that process? That one seems harder to give a yes for, but if the answer isn't yes, then how can it be a yes for the Ship of Theseus example? And if the answer isn't yes to that, then you aren't the same person from moment to moment. So how does that make sense? Another weird and wacky one is the whole split brain thing. The human brain has 2 different hemispheres to it, like lots of the other animals that we share a common ancestor with, and those 2 hemispheres in some senses do similar things, but some tasks are kind of specialized to one hemisphere or the other. And sometimes if someone has really, really bad epilepsy, one treatment is to actually cut the structure that bridges the 2 hemispheres, meaning they essentially have 2 independent brains after this procedure happens. And it is actually an effective treatment a lot of the time, but it creates this weird effect where they now essentially have 2 brains. Like the side of the brain that's responsible for speech and is responsible for one of the eyes can look at something and then say what it's looking at, whereas the other hemisphere isn't responsible for speech. So if the eye that it's responsible for is looking at something, the person can't verbally say what it is that eye is looking at. But the half of the brain that's looking at something does have control of one of the hands, and the hand can write down what the person's looking at. It's fucking bizarre. So it seems like there's kind of two people inside all of us. It's really fucking weird. I don't really know what to make of that, to be honest. Like, is there some other conscious entity that we don't know about that can't communicate that's inside all of us? Is that what my subconscious is? I've no idea. I really actually genuinely don't know what to make of that one. Sorry to interrupt, this is just a quick message to say, statistically speaking, you're probably not subscribed, so I'll make you a deal. Press the subscribe button and I won't come over to your house and do this.
Good night, girl. I'll see you tomorrow.
Alright, thanks. Back to the video. Another one is the idea of a philosophical zombie, which I jokingly mentioned earlier, but the actual concept is someone or something that looks exactly the same as a conscious being, but they're not actually having a conscious perception of reality, right? You know, like an NPC in a video game is just there to be an NPC, right? A non-player character. There is no first-person experience of what it's like to be that person, because they're not a real person, they don't have consciousness, but they do effectively imitate being conscious. So theoretically, could you have a machine with a body, robots, right, presumably are also doing the same thing. Some people seem to think that artificial intelligence either has or at some point will develop consciousness. I'm not totally sure given the way that it currently works, because it's kind of more like a prediction engine. Then again, our brains are also kind of like prediction engines, so I don't know. But the point is, could you even have a biological human being that has no internal conscious perception? Just no conscious experience whatsoever corresponds to what's happening in their brain. Some people think that it's substrate dependent, so like you need biological matter in order for consciousness to happen. So all people would be conscious, and maybe all animals, but no machines would ever be conscious. But I'm not really convinced about that. I don't really know what about biological organisms would be the special thing that's needed for consciousness to exist. I'm sure I could be convinced, but right now I just can't really see what the argument would be, besides just kind of vibing it out. Now, I would presume that there are certain brain parts or certain types of, I don't know, flows of information, or there's something that inherently corresponds to conscious experience for some reason. I don't know what it is, but there's definitely some way that physical phenomena somehow map onto conscious phenomena, but I have no idea how that works. That basically is the hard problem of consciousness, is figuring out how that even works. But you could theoretically imagine that some people just actually aren't conscious, because there's no way that you can verify whether they are or not. You can't do any experiment to determine if they are. All you know is that you're conscious. You don't know that anyone else is conscious. We actually don't even know if physical reality exists materially. In fact, if you're me, you think it doesn't, which is one of my slightly wackier takes on things, but I think it's justified. A lot of people have had the thought before of maybe when I see a color, say I see red, and you see a color, so you're seeing red, does our first-person conscious experience of reality produce the same sensation? Like, is my red the same as your red? Which on its own is interesting, but I take it a lot further, because I would say that whenever we're empirically observing the universe, right, whenever we're looking at shit, or listening to shit, or thinking about shit, whatever it is that we're doing, always we're using consciousness to interact with reality. And no matter what kind of experiment that we do, ultimately it gets filtered through our perceptions and ends up in consciousness, and that's how we know what the result of some experiment was. So there is no objective way to observe reality, fundamentally. Every single thing that we have a description for ultimately corresponds to some perception within consciousness. So all you really know is that the things that are appearing within your fields of awareness are appearing. That's it. That's all you know. And a lot of folks will say that there must be more to it than that, because the conscious experiences that we're undergoing are consistent, right? If I'm holding an object and I let go of the object, I know that it's going to fall, right? Things behave in certain ways, and that's explained by the existence of a physical reality. But I'd say that that presumes that you need a physical reality. Ultimately, why can't that just be the way that the contents of consciousness behaves? If you were to hypothetically imagine that only your consciousness exists, and then to explain the structure of the universe, we just say, well, yeah, that's just how consciousness is structured. That seems to be a valid explanation. But it doesn't necessarily imply that there is a separate external thing that we call material reality. You could say that if everything is just consciousness, then that doesn't have any explanatory power about why the contents of consciousness seem to act in a certain way. But then again, we don't ultimately have that for a material reality either. It assists in coming up with very accurate descriptions because it's a very good way to model it. But the question of why physical reality ultimately exists is also an unscientific question, even if you apply it to materialism. So this actually doesn't really work either way. In the ultimate sense, I think materialism might just be an easier way to conceptualize what's happening than what is actually happening. And to further back this up, if the only things that you can ever have empirical evidence for are things which ultimately arrive in consciousness as qualia, then the existence of a material physical world is actually an unfalsifiable hypothesis. Any observation only further confirms that only consciousness exists. I guess really people don't like this because it throws into question what even is the model of reality that we have then, which is a very good question. What is this, like solipsism or some shit? And that tends to come off to people as a bit weird and depressing. What I'll say in general is that I think the assumption that since you can model physical reality as this external material thing, that therefore that's the scientific way of looking at it, and therefore simply regarding things as contents within consciousness must be an unscientific way of looking at it. I just don't think that's right. I know that on first glance this kind of feels a bit loose and vague and kind of spiritualism tangential, but my honest feeling is that if you really want to understand reality at the deepest possible levels, I think you have to confront this kind of stuff. If you want to understand things, you just have to put the work in to understand them. Like when you imagine something that seems like a very kind of scientific kind of a thing, I don't know, imagine like the distance between two objects, right? It's just some raw physical fact about material reality. You know, I've got one object over here on my desk and 10 centimeters away there's another object. Okay, but what is distance? Ultimately, both of these objects have only ever been appearances within my fields of awareness, and the concept of distance is effectively just a rule to determine how different objects within my fields of awareness behave. Like on some level, every single description of anything material and physical and separate from consciousness ultimately is just referring to a thing within consciousness. Usually we're referring to some model that we've built of reality that we keep in our thought field, or the cognition field, whatever you want to call it, the field where we keep our models of how we think reality works, but that in and of itself is just another field of consciousness, you know? I know that the planet Mars exists physically, materially, in some respect, but really on a deeper level, what's actually happening is that my thought field has a model in it, and that model is how objects are distributed in the universe, and Mars is one of those things, and that model is within consciousness. So not only am I saying the more kind of well-established, well-known thing that you can't prove that material reality exists, I'm actually going further and saying that in some way it's kind of nonsensical, the idea that material reality exists separately from consciousness. I know that brings up a lot of f***ing questions. Like, you're telling me that material reality exists, but the only possible way that you can describe the existence of this thing is with references to things that can only exist as qualia. Like, there is no possible way you can even imagine what physical reality even looks like, because you're always just imagining your own qualia. I feel like that undermines the existence of the material reality in the first place. Am I losing my f***ing mind? I feel like I'm losing my f***ing mind. Like, what is the moon, materially? Well, it's objectively grey. No, it isn't. Grey is a thing that can only exist within your field of vision. Okay, then photons materially exist with whatever wavelength they've got. How do we know? We only know that by experimenting and then observing the fucking result of the experiment as qualia. It's all qualia. I'm gonna finish up with the thing that I mentioned in the introduction, which is kind of a weird thing about consciousness that at least I haven't heard from anyone before. I'm assuming other people have thought of this. I just, for whatever reason, I just haven't personally heard anyone else mention it. So I thought I'd bring it up because it's a really weird thing to think about. So imagine your field of vision, that is one of these fields that exists within consciousness. Imagine the field that is just one eye. It's kind of this oval shape. It's actually really hard to figure out, like, just try and figure out what shape the entire field of vision is. It's weirdly hard to do because intuitively you're going to try and move your eyeball around to find the edge of your field of vision, but all that's going to do is move where the center of your field of vision is, right? Wherever you're looking is the center. So it's a little hard to measure, but you can make someone look in one direction and then kind of draw an outline on a whiteboard that's right on the periphery of things that they can see while they're looking directly forward and get kind of a rough shape for what the field of vision is. And yeah, it's kind of a rough oval shape just as a consequence of like the optics of the human eye. But on a deeper level, I want you to ask yourself the question, right? You've got this field of vision. What is beyond the edges of your field of vision? I know that sounds like a weird question, but like, think about it. Whenever we're imagining any object in physical reality, that object exists within space. If there's ever an instance where that isn't the case, people get freaked out by it, like trying to imagine what the universe is expanding into, right? Like, what does that even mean? Of course, it's more like space is growing, but anyway, that's a whole different subject. Around your field of vision, there isn't anything. And it's not just blackness, it's like nothing. It's so nothing that there isn't anything. There's not even blackness. It's not as if what you perceive as vision is an oval within an infinite black field around the oval. That's not what it's like, is it? Like, it doesn't feel like there's anything around it. There just is the oval that you can see shit inside of. Now that's step one of thinking about this weird thought that I've had. The next step is to not just consider one eye, but both of them. You've actually got two fields of vision, and the way that we perceive things is that those fields overlap with each other so that you get depth perception, right? Your brain can kind of interpolate three-dimensionality, even though it's only getting two flat two-dimensional images. So even though you can't see any space around the oval that is your field of vision, if you go from having one eye closed to having it open, that total absence of space around that one field of vision somehow expands to now incorporate the additional space taken up by the second field of vision. Do you ever think about that? That's fucking crazy. How does that happen? Nothing in physical reality works that way. Consciously, it seems like there's no space for that other field to be in. Somehow, that perceptual space broadens and you can fit the other oval in there. Does this make any sense at all? I don't know if I'm talking crazy talk, but does that imply that the possible space in which vision could exist is infinitely large? Could you fit an infinite amount of vision into a conscious experience? Because if you can just punch extra holes in this weird consciousness latent space, it doesn't seem obvious that there's a limit to how much you can do that. And then the last step of all of this is to ask, how exactly does your brain know to overlap these two distinct fields of vision? Like, if you had a third eye, like just imagine you, like, I don't know, say you took an eye from a cadaver and the eye is still functional, and somehow you managed to wire it into your brain. If you wanted to have this eye in the middle of your forehead, do like a TN thing from Dragon Ball Z, would your brain automatically know where to put that third field of vision? Or could it show up in just kind of a random location within consciousness? Like, could it be distant from the other two? And would, over time, having that third eye there, would your brain remap itself to properly overlay it with the vision that you already have? You know what I mean? I've never heard anyone talk about this, but I genuinely have no fucking idea what would happen. However, there is one thing that I know is going to happen, and that's me thanking my elite level supporters: Thunderbolt 22810, who was raised by Space Wolves; Nomad Greg, who makes his own mayonnaise with the degenerate matter of dead stars; Andrew Mole, whose teeth are on backwards; John Bejarano, whose lobotomy served only to make him more wise and powerful; JDK, who is known by uncontacted tribes in South America as the Great Wide One; Mutantious Doom, whose IQ got so low it circled past negative infinity and became gigantic again; Stormmaster Ritter, who can pause reality to go take a dump; Nikita Lurie, who can calculate the trajectory of a passing sparrow; Aaron Rowe, who the boogeyman is terrified of; Bonk Chunk, who is as abrupt as he is satisfying; That One Boy, who likes to sit in dark rooms and drink lots of fluids; Trenton Caldwell, who once killed a man by tearing out his spine and beating him to death with it; and thanks to all my other supporters too. Don't forget to join the Patreon or the channel membership if you want to be featured in my video credits or chat on the Discord, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.